Under the lights of the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts stands a Douglas SBD-5 Dauntless whose surface does not resemble a newly finished restoration. The paint is faded and uneven. Panels carry stains, scars, and areas where time has removed the finish entirely. Yet some of what remains was already on the airplane in January 1944 when it disappeared beneath Lake Michigan. The aircraft is Bureau number 36177. It was not recovered from a battlefield. It did not return from a famous strike, and no victory markings explain why it deserves a place in a museum. Its story belongs to the enormous training system behind the Pacific War, to two unlikely aircraft carriers operating beside Chicago, and to a recovery that brought a recognizable Navy dive bomber out of cold fresh water after more than half a century. To understand why it sank, the story begins with USS Wolverine and USS Sable. Neither ship had been designed as an aircraft carrier. Both began as passenger vessels. The Navy rebuilt them with flight decks and operated them on Lake Michigan, where pilots could practice carrier takeoffs and landings far from enemy submarines and coastal attack. The arrangement placed naval aviation over fresh water, within reach of Chicago, but the work performed on those decks was real carrier training. A pilot still had to bring an aircraft down a narrow approach, hold the correct airspeed and alignment, and place the wheels inside a short landing area. The deck moved with the ship. Wind and lake conditions changed. The landing signal officer watched each approach and directed the pilot toward the point where the arresting hook could catch a wire. There was little room for delay. A carrier approach concentrated several demands into a few seconds. If the aircraft was too high, too low, too fast, or too slow, the approach could be abandoned. But close to the water, an engine problem could remove even that choice. The Navy needed large numbers of carrier-qualified pilots, and the two lake carriers maintained an intense schedule. Repetition made training possible. It also produced losses. Official Navy history records 38 SBD Dauntlesses lost during Lake Michigan operations. Bureau number 36177 entered that system as an almost new airplane. The Navy accepted it at Naval Air Station Alameda on October 7, 1943. It was an SBD-5, one of the later wartime versions of the Dauntless. The type had become famous as a dive bomber, but this particular aircraft was sent east for training duty at Naval Air Station Glenview, near Chicago. Its work was routine by wartime standards. It helped pilots practice the skill they would need before joining operational carrier units. That history is less dramatic than combat, but no less connected to it. Every pilot who qualified on Wolverine or Sable had to learn on an actual aircraft with actual fuel, machinery, and risk. Training consumed hours, engines, airframes, and sometimes lives. Only a little more than 3 months after the Navy accepted the Dauntless, its own service ended. On January 19, 1944, Ensign Ronald Kelly was flying the aircraft toward USS Wolverine during carrier qualification training. The Dauntless was on its approach when it lost power. The surviving account does not identify the exact mechanical fault. It does not say which component failed or how rapidly the power disappeared. But the immediate consequence is clear. The carrier deck remained ahead, and the airplane could no longer reach it. An aircraft on final approach is already low. It has little altitude available to exchange for distance, and the deck is not a fixed runway stretching away across land. Kelly put the Dauntless down on the water before Wolverine. After the water landing, the aircraft sank. A machine accepted by the Navy the previous October disappeared into Lake Michigan during a training flight. Its service had lasted only a few months. There was no combat damage to explain its loss, and no enemy action to place it in a battle narrative. The cause recorded at the decisive moment was simpler. The engine lost power, the carrier remained beyond reach, and the lake became the only surface available. The public history does not establish the exact attitude in which the Dauntless came to rest, its depth, or how much sediment accumulated around it. Those details are well documented for some other Navy aircraft in the lake, and that creates a danger. A depth, a broken engine, or an underwater position belonging to another Dauntless can easily migrate into this story through repetition. For 36177, the safe image is also the strongest. The aircraft went down in January 1944 and remained beneath the lake while the entire world that had created it disappeared. The war ended. Wolverine and Sable left service. Glenview's wartime training tempo faded. Aircraft that had once been urgently needed became obsolete, then rare. Above the wreck, ships crossed the lake and seasons turned. Below, cold fresh water worked slowly on aluminum, steel, rubber, fabric, paint, and oil. Submersion was destructive, but Lake Michigan also created unusual conditions for survival. Salt water accelerates corrosion in aircraft metals. The Great Lakes contain far less salt, and their deeper water remains cold. Those conditions do not protect an airframe completely, but they can slow some chemical and biological deterioration. Navy accounts of Lake Michigan wrecks describe paint, markings, rubber, fabric, and lubricants surviving after decades underwater. Different materials still failed at different rates. Steel fasteners could corrode beside aluminum skin. Fabric could remain in one protected area and disappear in another. Sediment could shield a surface while pressure and impact damage weakened the structure around it. The result was not a preserved airplane in the ordinary sense. It was a damaged aircraft whose identity and a surprising amount of original material could still survive. That distinction would shape every later decision. By the time recovery became possible, the Dauntless was no longer valuable because it could be returned quickly to service. It was valuable because so few original wartime aircraft remained, and because the lake had preserved evidence that restoration could easily erase. The objective was not simply to retrieve metal. It was to bring up an identifiable airframe without destroying the features that made it historically useful. In the mid-1990s, a recovery operation returned Bureau number 36177 to the surface. The surviving public record does not provide a complete operational account of the lift. It does not preserve the number of divers, the precise rigging plan, the recovery vessel, or the order in which the airframe was secured. Even the exact date remains inconsistent in later records. But the absence of those details does not reduce the importance of the operation. It shifts attention to what the recovery team was actually confronting. The object below them had the shape of an airplane, but it could not be treated like one ready to fly. A sound Dauntless carries its weight through a structure designed for flight and landing. After more than 50 years underwater, corrosion, impact damage, and hidden weakness could change how that structure responded. A lift applied through the wrong point might save one section while tearing another apart. The first problem was therefore not height, it was support. Before the aircraft could become a museum object, its remaining structure had to survive the transition from resting in water to being carried by recovery equipment. Water supported parts of the wreck from every direction. Once the airframe began to rise, gravity returned as the dominant load. Cavities could retain water. Sediment and loose material could add weight. Sections that had remained stable on the bottom could move when the aircraft changed angle. A recovery team dealing with such an object has to control that change. The load must be spread rather than concentrated. Movement must remain slow enough to reveal trouble before it becomes a break. The aircraft does not need to look fragile for its structure to be fragile. No surviving source for 36177 allows the lift to be described cable by cable. What can be followed is the sequence of consequences. For more than half a century, the Dauntless had been supported by the lake and the bottom beneath it. During recovery, that support was transferred to human equipment. The aircraft left the place where it had settled in 1944. It moved upward through the cold water toward light, air, and a completely different form of risk. At the surface, success did not mean the operation was finished. An aircraft emerging from fresh water carries the lake with it. Water remains inside seams, tubes, instruments, and enclosed spaces. Mud and biological material cling to surfaces. Corrosion products that developed in a stable underwater environment are suddenly exposed to oxygen and changing temperature. If the airframe is allowed to dry without control, deterioration can continue or accelerate. The recovered Dauntless therefore had to remain supported. Loose contamination had to be removed without stripping away evidence beneath it. Areas that appeared strong could not automatically be trusted. Paint that had survived underwater might detach once the surface dried. The objective was no longer to make the aircraft rise. It was to prevent the recovery itself from becoming the event that destroyed what the lake had preserved. This is where salvage became conservation. A newly manufactured aircraft can be washed, moved, and handled according to established service procedures. A long-submerged wreck requires a different logic. Every operation must answer two competing needs. Dirt, salts, and unstable corrosion have to be removed, but original paint and markings should remain when they can be saved. Weak structure must be supported, but new supports should not disguise the surviving construction. Missing parts may be replaced for display, but replacement must not turn an original airframe into an undocumented replica. The detailed workshop record for this Dauntless is not available in the public sources used for its history. There is no complete list showing every part retained, repaired, or replaced. That means the finished airplane should not be described as untouched or entirely original. Yet the result is equally far from an ordinary reconstruction. The recovered airframe remained recognizable. Significant wartime finish survived. The surface that emerged from Lake Michigan still carried a direct physical connection to the aircraft accepted by the Navy in 1943 and lost the following January. That surviving finish changed the purpose of the restoration. A perfectly smooth new coat of paint might have produced a cleaner display, but it would also have covered the evidence that made this aircraft distinct. The stains, losses, and uneven color were not merely defects. They showed that the surface had passed through wartime service, immersion, recovery, and stabilization. The best restoration decision was not always the one that made the aircraft look newest. Once the structure was stable enough for museum use, the Dauntless entered a new chain of custody. The National Museum of Naval Aviation controlled the aircraft and could place it on loan, allowing another institution to display the Lake Michigan survivor while retaining its connection to the Navy collection. The next clearly documented move came in February 2010. The aircraft arrived in Hawaii at the Pacific Aviation Museum, now the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. It was placed in Hangar 37 as a loan from the National Museum of Naval Aviation. The arrangement solved a practical museum problem. Pearl Harbor wanted a Dauntless on display while restoration continued on another aircraft, SBD-2P, Bureau number 2173. The two airplanes had separate histories. Bureau number 2173 was an earlier reconnaissance version associated with Pearl Harbor. The loan aircraft was the SBD-5 recovered from Lake Michigan. One represented the museum's own long restoration project. The other allowed visitors to see a Dauntless while that work continued. For the Lake Michigan aircraft, the move added another environment to a history already shaped by dramatic changes. It had gone from a Douglas production line to Navy acceptance, from Glenview to a carrier approach, from the lake surface to the bottom, and from recovery into conservation. Now it crossed the Pacific as a museum object. Its identity was repeatedly recorded. The museum's arrival announcement identified the airplane as Bureau number 36177. Collection reports from 2013 and 2014 listed the SBD-5 in Hangar 37 under the same number. The consistency mattered because the airplane's appearance alone could not preserve its complete history. A museum object depends on documents linking the physical machine to the events attributed to it. Years later, one of those documents created a problem. In 2021, Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum published an article explaining that the loaned SBD-5 would leave Hawaii and move to a museum associated with the Collings Foundation in Massachusetts. The article described the Lake Michigan aircraft, its recovery, and the coming transfer, but it identified the Dauntless as Bureau number 36711. That number conflicts with the museum's own earlier reports. It also conflicts with the identity recorded by the museum that received the airplane afterward. The contradiction does not require a hidden exchange of aircraft. The documented chain points to a simpler explanation. The number in the 2021 article was most likely a clerical or transcription error. The aircraft arriving in Hawaii in 2010 was recorded as 36177. The Dauntless displayed in Hangar 37 in 2013 and 2014 carried that identity. The aircraft preparing to leave was the same loaned Lake Michigan SBD. When the American Heritage Museum later received it in Massachusetts, its collection record again identified it as 36177. The wrong number appeared in the middle of an otherwise continuous record. That error may look minor beside the physical work of raising an aircraft from a lake, but identity is part of preservation. A recovered airframe without a reliable number can absorb the accident, pilot, or service history of another machine. The metal may survive, while the story attached to it becomes false. Correcting the number, therefore, belongs to the same task as preserving the paint. One protects the physical evidence, the other protects the connection between that evidence and a particular aircraft. In May 2022, the Navy approved the transfer of the SBD-5 from Pearl Harbor to the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. There it entered another exhibition, still identified as Bureau number 36177. Some questions remain open. The exact mechanical cause of the power loss has not been established in the available public account. The precise date and detailed method of the mid-1990s recovery remain uncertain. The full conservation record is incomplete. Those gaps do not need to be filled with borrowed details. The confirmed story is already unusual enough. A nearly new dive bomber lost power while approaching an aircraft carrier on a freshwater lake. It sank during a training program that qualified naval aviators for a global war. Cold water damaged it, but also preserved markings and material that might have vanished in the sea. More than half a century later, a recovery operation transferred the weakened airframe from the lake bottom to human support, then from salvage into conservation. Museums carried it across the country and across the Pacific. Finally, a chain of records had to recover its identity from a single wrong number. Under the lights in Massachusetts, the aircraft does not need to appear untouched to be authentic. Its authenticity lies in the sequence visible on its surface. It was manufactured, accepted, flown, lost, submerged, raised, stabilized, transported, and displayed. Each stage altered it. None erased the link completely. The airplane is not a polished image of a Dauntless at the height of a combat career. It is the surviving result of a career that ended almost as soon as it began. That is why the recovery matters. The operation did more than remove an old aircraft from Lake Michigan. It changed the type of evidence that survived. Beneath the water, the Dauntless was a wreck site, protected in part by its environment and understood only through survey and records. At the surface, it became vulnerable in new ways, but also available for conservation, study, and public display. The lake had kept the aircraft beyond ordinary reach. Recovery returned it to history, but only because the people handling it did not treat survival as the same thing as strength. The final contradiction remains in the paint. More than 50 years underwater did not remove all of it. The surviving finish crossed the distance from January 1944 to the present on the same metal to which it had first been applied. The lake preserved the airplane. Later paperwork nearly lost its number, but the machine standing in Massachusetts can still be connected to the Navy aircraft accepted at Alameda, the training fields near Chicago, the moving deck of USS Wolverine, and the winter day when that deck remained just beyond reach. Its number is 36177.